The Globe Theatre in London is probably one of the most significant pieces of architecture that can teach us about Tudor England. See, this building was first made in the 1570s, and it really came into fruition when theatre became more popular and came into the mainstream. You see, this is when people had more money to go out and spend time out enjoying the arts, enjoying culture in Tudor England, and it made a huge boost in the local economy and made businesses like this more and more viable. This was made originally in the 1570s, and there was a huge legal dispute between the guy who owned the land, his name was Giles Allen, I believe, and the Burbages, who were the family that built this theatre, and they ran this theatre, and they invested really heavily in it. And there was a huge dispute between the landowners and the owners of the theatre, and it became very, very problematic until a point where the building was actually ripped apart and it was ferried across the Thames and put into a new location to solve this issue, because they couldn't find an agreeable way of doing that. Another really interesting thing you can look at is the idea of status. So in this theatre here, you can see that there are the seating areas around the sides, and then there is the ground floor, and that's where the groundlings, which is what they were called at the time, that's the poorer people who got in for a very, very low price. They would all stand around the bottom bit there. They were sometimes known as the stinkards in the hotter weather. I'm sure you can imagine why. And then there's the royalty. So royalty would sit in the royal boxes, which are still present in most theatres today. And that's where the royalty would sit, and they would not get a particularly good view of the stage. They were normally very side on, but they wanted to sit there because they wanted to be seen by as many people as possible. They wanted to be seen to be cultured and very high status, and so they would sit in the royal boxes. They wouldn't get to see as much of the show, but it meant that they were important. People were looking at them as well as the show. So it was really interesting to see that probably the groundlings probably got the best atmosphere. There was a lot going on the ground. You could go and buy food. You could buy food to eat or to throw at actors you didn't like. I'm sure it was a lot of fun down there. Probably very tiring, very hot, very sweaty, particularly throughout the day as it goes on, because the plays that went on at this theatre were very, very long. Another interesting aspect of it is the health and safety aspect of it. Now, this theatre it's got the wooden beams on it, which is what I'm just attaching now to one of the upper floors here. So I'll hold it up so you can see it here. So these structures around here, the wooden beams, that's very typical of Tudor architecture. It's probably what most people think of when they hear about it, and it's what led to the burning down of the building in 1613. So there was a production of Henry V. I think it was Henry V. I think it was a production of Henry V. Let me check. I was wrong. It was a production of Henry VIII that burnt down the theatre, not Henry V. Henry VIII, where there was a cannon that was a huge special effects that Shakespeare wanted in the show. He invested a lot of money in his special effects, but it actually led to the burning down and the destruction of the theatre itself. Thankfully, nobody got hurt. There's one amusing story about how the worst thing that happened was there was a man who caught fire, but somebody threw a jug of beer on him, and that put out the fire. So that says a lot about what was going on at the time. But those special effects that burned down the theatre, that was something that William Shakespeare was really interested in at the time. He invested a lot of his own money into progressing the theatre and making sure that his plays were the best ones out there. He had a lot of competition, particularly towards the end of his life, with other theatres that were being built around London, and so he wanted to step ahead of the game by bringing in special effects like this cannon, which ultimately destroyed the place because of how it was made. So, and this is actually interesting because it links to the Great Fire of London, which happened in 1666. That same wattle and daub structure was what led to the destruction of lots and lots of houses across London. So that's an interesting historical link there between this theatre and the Great Fire of London. And this fire actually led to the end of Shakespeare's career. So in 1613, when the Globe was destroyed, a number of people came together and decided to rebuild it, but Shakespeare didn't want to be a part of that. And that was actually a part of what led him to go back to Stratford-upon-Avon to live with his family for the last 3 years of his life before he died in 1616. This theatre had a huge impact on what happened to William Shakespeare, how he lived out the rest of his life. I mean, it's hard to think now could have happened if the theatre hadn't burnt down. Would Shakespeare have written more plays? Would there have been more performances? It's hard to say really, but this theatre itself has an instrumental impact on what happened to Shakespeare at the end of his life. I mean, there were some suggestions that he wasn't very well towards the end of his life. It was suggested that he had a shaky handwriting, which could be affected by a few different illnesses that were going around at the time. And speaking of which, I think that that's quite apt for this moment in history actually, because a lot of these theatres had to close during the early 17th century because of illness and plague that was going around, which is obviously something that's been happening recently this year. Not with plague, but obviously with the coronavirus. And it's another interesting link about where this theatre plays into the idea of community and life around them. So they knew that to prevent small cases of the plague, they would have to shut down buildings like this, and that did happen to quite a lot of places around London. A lot of people lost their jobs and missed out on these productions because of what was going on in terms of illness and health in London. As I say, I think that this theatre is a really, really important part of how we understand Tudor life, and it's been really interesting building this scale model of it. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to link in with our work in schools, particularly with the uncertainty as to when we're going to be getting back into schools, but it's been a great excuse to learn more about architecture and theatres in Tudor England, and it's been really fiddly but a lot of fun, and I can't wait to show you when it's finished.